here's a question I want to kick off this Q&A with, because it's a major challenge and you touched on aspects of it, but I hear many, including those in the old earth and theistic evolution camps, they will say this, Professor McIntosh, they'll say, okay, if we look at ancient civilizations, I'm trying to provide some context here. They'll say, since we see animals, let's say felids, and if we were to approximate the created kind at the family level, and of course not in all instances, but let's say an approximation, then you have felid species like lions, you have domestic cats and other types of cats. They're depicted in ancient Egyptian art. Yep. And since Egyptian civilization would have began shortly after the flood or after the Tower of Babel dispersal, does that mean speciation had to be really fast after the flood in the young earth creation model to basically get a felid archetype off of the ark, and within, I guess, less than 1,000 years, depending on how we would view that, species like lions and even domestic cats?
Well, there's two answers to this. I think actually you can get pretty fast speciation, but we need to be careful here, because I don't take the view that the animals were hugely different to what we have today. I think they were recognizable as the cat kind, the dog kind, but some have suggested, and I did mention this as I went through, that you could have domestic dogs and wild dogs, two of each being on, male and female, being on the ark. Plus the fact that for the clean animals, and I'm not sure whether this would cover it necessarily, but for the clean animals, there is, of course, seven pairs implied. But let's just keep it just to one pair, because I think in the main we're dealing with wild animals, or rather unclean animals. So if you have one pair of dogs, domestic dogs, put it that way, and one pair of wolves, then then I don't think you necessarily have the same problem in getting to the big wolves, and by the way, even from one pair of dogs, you can easily get rather large dogs like the Alsatians that we have today, and tiny little, Chihuahuas that we also have today. They're all descended from basic dog kind. And the same applies to cats. You can get large cats and small cats. But if you're really worried about the fact that you get lions as well, I would say it's quite possible that you had a pair of wild cats, which were also on the ark. So I don't think there is a great problem here. I think speciation also, even if you only have one pair, is possible. There's a huge variety. There's a huge capacity for a different genetic alleles, we call them, different genetic expression of size and even type of teeth and all the rest of it from the creatures that were on the ark.
I think that's a great answer. And there's many excellent points that you touched on there. If we have domestic dogs, I guess a clarifying question, if we have domestic dogs and then a wolf type or a wolf archetype on the ark, that would mean that in the pre-flood world, they were domesticating dogs then, and cats perhaps too?
Yes. Are you saying just one pair on this argument, line of reasoning?
Yeah, I guess if I understood you correctly, were you saying that there could be like a pair of domestic dogs and a pair of, let's say, wolves on the ark?
Yes.
Okay.
I think that is a possibility. I'm not saying dogmatically that that's the case, but frankly, if you just have another pair, which is of a different, because you remember you're already dealing with a fallen world. you've already had dogs made 1600 years earlier, right?
Right.
You've got dogs of different types already in the pre-flood world. So I don't find it too much of a how can I put it, a different, I don't find it too much of an argument from silence to say the word kind could mean a very much a wild dog and a domesticated dog. Similarly, a wild cat with a domesticated cat. So it could be that that's what happened. But even if one didn't do that, you could still have, after the flood, huge variation. Even today, if you take a wild dog, right, a dog which is just running wild in Africa, you could breed all sorts of different types of dogs from that wild kind.
Do you think, and I think there's some really good points there and some fair points, do you think when critics make this argument, in a way, it's a straw man because it's proponents of common descent, Professor McIntosh, they argue, because you mentioned allelic variability or alleles in general, it's their starting point that all DNA diversity and all allelic variability is due to what? Mutations over time. But we as creationists, we might explain the vast majority of genetic variability as being front-loaded at creation. And so if those DNA differences are there from the start at creation, but then also in your ark animals, just through genetic processes after they get off the ark, such as recombination or gene conversion or isolation in terms of new varieties in these species, then you can get these new varieties quickly since those DNA differences are built in, rather than waiting a long time for mutations.
Yeah, we're not talking about building extra capacity. Building capacity is the wrong word, but we're not trying to argue for building new varieties, new creatures by evolutionary processes. No, let's forget that idea. Front loading is a very good phrase. God created in the original genetic information a massive amount of capacity for variation. Today we have, I'm not a geneticist, by the way, so I'm speaking as a more amateur on this, but I've listened to others who are experts. We have the whole field today, which has only opened up in the last, say, 10 years, of epigenetics, right? Yeah. There's a whole area of the gene, the whole area of genes called, for a long while, junk DNA, right? People were talking about junk DNA. And then a paper was written by a Cambridge team, actually, in England, which dismissed the idea of, well, not totally dismissed it, but basically said, oh, no, that DNA which we thought was junk actually is full of epigenetic switches, which will enable, under different environmental conditions, certain genes to switch on, which originally had lied dormant. In other words, it's actually confirming the front-loading view, which you just expressed earlier, that God has made the DNA, even in fallen creatures like we are, right? It was all due to Adam's sin, but God has caused all the creatures to suffer mutations and all the other stuff, genetic diseases and terrible things happening to them as well as to us. And death, of course, is the final cut off to all the creatures because of sin in Adam and sin in us. God, nevertheless, has still created a large capacity for creatures, I'll use the word, to adapt to different environments. That's not evolution, not in the way that I'm using it. I never use the word evolution for that, because in the general mindset of the population, as soon as you use the word evolution, you're thinking of survival of the fittest and other creatures dying out and mutations, the neo-Darwinian synthesis. So I'm reserving the word evolution for that. I'm not using the word evolution. I don't use the word microevolution. A phrase rather, microevolution. I use the term adaptation. Yes, there is room for some mutations which will cause diseases and change, but that has no capacity to change creatures into another creature. You can't change. The feline kind has retractable claws, right? We're talking about feline and canine. Canines don't have retractable claws. You have fierce, horrible jaws in wolves, obviously, which are part of the canine kind, but you don't have the retractable claws. You'd never actually develop a cat from a dog, right? Neither will you develop the other way around. So you've got canines, a huge variety of canines. You've got felines, but they're still felines, huge variety.
Well, that's an excellent point right there. I think you nailed it. And we're not, as you said, it's the evolutionists that would have to explain an increase in phenotypic complexity or the addition of novel features like eyes and wings and legs. We're just talking about the manifestation of that which has been front loaded. It's basic adaptation. And I think you just answered this challenge, Professor McIntosh. We have some critics in our chat. We do appreciate our critics being here in order that we can hopefully plant some seeds and address some objections. And correct me if I'm wrong, you just answered this. So this critic says, if front loaded, where is the evidence? Well, the old paradigm of junk DNA has been overturned. We understand more and more the sophisticated nature of epigenetics. And they've discovered with ENCODE and follow-up projects that over 80% of the genome is active to some extent. And in many ways, that would confirm what we're discussing here about front-loaded genetic diversity.
They've also shown that rather than us being different, rather than us being 99%, or they might have said at times a little bit less than that, but it was somewhere in the region of 97 to 99%. Well, let's take this 99%, right? That they tried to argue that we were 99% the same as chimps. But now they're realizing that when you actually look at this more carefully, it's nowhere near 99%. It's certainly down. The difference is up by 2%, 3%, right? So that it's actually maybe even more than that. I'm just giving the critic the benefit of the doubt here. As soon as you move from 1% difference, the amount of difference between us and animals, if you even go, just say it's 97%, right, the same, even that, frankly, is questionable. You actually are increasing the difference hugely, such that you're relying, when you actually look at the differences between the working genes of a chimp and the working genes of humans, you're finding that the differences represented even by 3% is huge. And you cannot actually justify the position that was before, that, we are virtually the same as apes in our genetic structure. No, we're not. We're very, very different.
Professor McIntosh, that's a great point. It has come out in the conventional literature. It's been established even more so recently that if you were to look at just the Y chromosome, which is paternally inherited, when you compare the Y chromosomes between humans and chimpanzees, and you consider overall gene content, architecture, and size differences, the Y chromosomes are less than 30% the same. Well, somewhere between 25. There's a lot of differences there.
Yeah, there are. That's an important point. That I hadn't picked up. So you've taught me something there, and your listeners and viewers, concerning those issues. I'm not a genetic expert. I can only go by what I read of others. So yes. I think you do need, to be fair to that critic, you do need, if you're going to talk about genetic evidence, then you do need to bring a geneticist on. And the person I'd recommend that your viewers consider his writings is Robert Carter from
Yes.
Creation Ministries International, who is a geneticist. And there are others as well who work in the field of genetics.
Absolutely. And Dr. Rob Carter, we highly respect. We've had him on before, and we had a show dedicated to Adam, Eve, and genetics. And so, okay, I really appreciate you engaging that challenge, Professor McIntosh, because that's a major one. And I think you provided some really good insight and some good answers.